Mr. Mayor, it's time.
I'd like to call this special meeting to order for the Douglas City Council on June 5th, 2024. Roll call, please.
Mayor Donald Hewish,
Here.
Mayor Pro Tempore Margaret Morales, Councilmember Jose Montaño,
Here.
Councilmember Dania Acosta, present. Councilmember Ray Shelton,
Present.
Councilmember Michael Valdenegro, Councilmember Richard Acosta,
Present.
City Manager Ana Urquijo,
Present.
City Attorney Dennis Fitzgibbons,
Present.
City Treasurer Luis Pedrosa.
Present.
Thank you. And Mr. Mayor, for the record, Mayor Pro Tempore Margaret Morales is excused and Councilmember Michael Valdenegro is on his way.
Thank you very much. And again, I apologize to everyone for being remote at this particular time, but due to some extenuating circumstances, they have me isolated away, which is at least for another week or so. Item number 3, persons wishing to address the council in writing or verbally on any item not on the agenda. Ms. Andrade, do we have anyone?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, we have Ms. Alice Novoa.
Please, Ms. Novoa, could you approach the podium, please?
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Alice Novoa, and I'm here before you as a citizen of the United States and also born and raised in Douglas, Arizona. The reason I'm here is to oppose your appointment to Alma Vildósola. Alma Vildósola, anybody who took the oath with her is in violation of the oath. And the reason is Alma Vildósola is an illegal alien. I'm using legal terms. Okay? Alma Vildósola is not from here. 1994, she started working as a deputy clerk for Justice of the Peace, Precinct 2, Joe Borain. She was not a citizen. She became a citizen under Citizenship USA in 1996. If you see her applications, they are all, she has committed perjury in each and every one of them. I have been running for 3 terms. I have run for Justice of the Peace Precinct 2, and I have won every time, and I have lost to the illegal alien vote since 1998. And this time, I'm going to continue. I would tell you not to vote for her or reappoint her as for city magistrate, because then you will become accountable. The reason you will become accountable is because you become a participant of her crime. And it's going to happen this year. So I thank you all for listening to me. And also, I just want to say one more thing. ARS, I think it's 38-231. It's the Arizona Constitution article and section 26 oath of office. Are you all aware that every single judge, every single person that works for the state or for the county or for the local level, local, county, state, and federal level has to take the oath of office? If not, it's, I believe, a 4 felony. So I would just tell you, check it out, do it, and just do it right. And get over quit aiding and abetting illegal aliens. This is not a sanctuary city, and it will cost the city of Douglas. Thank you very much, and God bless.
Thank you, Ms. Novoa. I'm sorry I didn't have my video on. My apologies. Item number 4, presentation discussion on item A, budget presentation for fiscal year 2024-2025. Again, we met with a joint meeting with the Finance Committee last week. Council members presented their input and asked questions. And we're here this evening to follow up on those questions, and hopefully staff can answer any other further questions on fiscal year budget. Mrs. Urquijo, will you be leading off?
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. We will actually be leading off by Mr. Alejandro Martinez. I'd like for the record to clarify it's Martinez. He will be leading us off, and then we will be available to answer any questions once we get the discussion going. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Martinez, please.
Good evening, Mayor and members of the council. You have in front of you the updated version of our Q&A. Questions that were asked during our last meeting, as well as the Finance Committee meeting, and the answers to those questions. So, again, if you have any further questions or clarification on those answers, we'll be happy to answer them. But before we do that, I would like to summarize. We held our Finance Committee budget recommendation meeting yesterday, and I'm going to go ahead and just read to make sure I don't miss anything. Just want to give you an idea of what we discussed in that meeting. And then I will turn it over to our chair to see if he has anything additional to add on behalf of the Finance Committee. So we met yesterday at noon, and Finance Committee is supportive of the proposed budget and voted unanimously in favor of the budget as presented. No specific modifications were recommended to the budget. However, in their motion for recommendation to mayor and council, they wanted to include the conversation that was had in the meeting and make sure that it was included as part of the motion, highlighting points of waiving transit fees, looking at all rate studies, and specifically defining the 2.5 million unrestricted reserve floor that we currently have. Finance Committee wanted to convey the sentiment that meaningful discussions and questions were asked before agreeing on the recommendation. They asked questions related to the state of the transit fund being in the negative. They felt this is a service the city should provide and would like to see in the future possibly waiving transit fees. It was explained to them this would require an increased subsidy from the general fund.
Mr. Martinez, if I may, Mr. Mayor, just for the record, Councilmember Michael Baldenegro is here at 5:36.
Welcome, Mr. Baldenegro. Please continue, Mr. Martinez.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A discussion took place on enterprise funds. Questions were asked about the impact of the rate study from 2021 and the need for one for our sanitation fund, which is included in the proposed budget. Questions came up about other funds like the general fund having a surplus and whether it could transfer funds to the enterprise funds at times where the citizens are in need and possibly the enterprise funds pay it back in the future. So in other words, do a transfer from the general fund to enterprise funds if it's bleeding money, and then have the enterprise, once it catches up, pay the money back to the general fund. That was another discussion that was had. Staff provided information that each fund is established with a purpose and with its own revenue sources for a specific purpose, and that transferring across funds does not solve the sustainability aspect of the fund. They asked for clarification on the $2.5 million floor for unrestricted fund balance. Some of the members' perception is that perhaps we're over-reserving on top of our 3 financial policy reserves, which is our debt, our capital, and our 45-day rainy day fund. They mentioned that more clearly defining the purpose of the $2.5 million floor would put the residents at ease knowing that it will be utilized in the future for capital needs before the port of entry comes online and the city sees the growth it expects. Chair, if you'd like to add anything at this point.
Welcome, Mr. Lindeman. Thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you, Mayor Hewish and council members, city staff. Mr. Martinez did a great job of synopsing our meeting the other day. I just wanted to say that we did have a good discussion amongst the members, and we had questions, but we did not actually specifically delineate any kind of a recommendation other than the budget looks good. And without those questions that we're recommending that you can decide on, we thank the staff and everyone involved for a good budget. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lindeman. Any questions from the council or discussion? Mrs. Urquijo, would you like to add anything at this time?
So that summarizes, to get us started, the Finance Committee's recommendation basically is to approve the budget as submitted with those few highlights for mayor and council to know that they discussed. So I'm open to answer any questions specific to those items, or we could jump right into some of your sheets. We also provided for you a QA set, which is something we've done in previous years, where we gather all of the questions asked at our joint meeting. We answered them at the joint meeting, but we like to provide them back to you for reference, so that you can look at things again as part of your review. But it is pretty much an evolving document or a living document, in that we also added after the joint meeting any questions that were brought up yesterday. There was one specific to adding wastewater rates, and then some questions on depreciation of capital. Those have been added to your QA set. And again, the QA set wasn't necessarily meant as new information today, because we did answer those questions last week, with the exception of those items brought up as highlighted from yesterday's Finance Committee recommendation. So I'm really now looking for Mayor and Council to direct questions on the submittal of the 24-25 recommended budget, and we're available to answer any specific questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kiko. And Mr. Martinez, could you walk us through the timeline of the approval meetings and such as we approach the final adoption of the budget?
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, so our next meeting on the 12th, you will be considering the approval of our tentative budget for fiscal year 25. And at that point, you're pretty much setting the limit for that, our ceiling for our budget. You still have a few weeks to make any changes. We just cannot increase the budget at any time anymore. The final adoption will be at a special meeting on the 10th of July, after we do our legal proceedings, which is publishing our schedules on the newspaper for 3 consecutive weeks, and then hosting a public hearing on the 10th of July. And then right after that, we'll have a special meeting just for the final adoption. So we're looking at 6/12 for our tentative adoption, which is next Wednesday at the regular meeting, and then at a special meeting on the 10th of July will be the final adoption.
Thank you, Mr. Martinez. So just by way of clarification, council, that in other words, that means that can't spend anymore, but we can also move funds within the budget as long as we don't increase the budget after the tentative adoption on June 12th. So again, any questions or discussion from the council at this point? And again, we'll have more discussion and input before the tentative adoption next week, in addition to this evening.
Correct, Mayor. And if I may add also, on May 29th, staff did send out a distribution of budget sheets in electronic form. Some of you may have requested that in print form. I'm not certain, but we could also go into any questions you have from those sheets. We can review items from the memorandum or from the PowerPoints that we've provided, or even from the QA sets. But I wanted to add a reminder that it won't be until after tentative budget that we receive our final state shared revenue forecast and numbers. So we also have that to deal with as a final challenge and final balancing if we have to make changes.
Thank you very much. Council, anything at this point in time?
Yes, Mr. Mayor.
Yes, Mr. Shelton, please.
I was glad to see the questions I had last time, have been answered in the sheet that was provided. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Shelton. Anyone else?
Mr. Mayor,
Yes, please, Mr. Acosta.
I just want to commend our city manager and her staff for the time and effort and the data they have provided for us in order for them to come up with this budget. Very detailed, and I'm all about data, and all the data has been provided here. So thank you, city manager and the staff. the finance committee for your job well done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. And again, those documents are also available at the city's website, if I'm not mistaken.
That is correct.
Thank you. We're going to move on to the next item unless there's any more questions. And if one comes up, please jot it down. And I think the agenda allows us the flexibility that we could return to this if something comes up in your thoughts as we listen to the next presentation. But I don't want to cut anybody off at all because this is, of course, a major of importance.
Yes, and Mayor, I'd like to add that we remain as a staff and budget team available for any questions that may come up as you continue to review all of the budget package, if that's the case. So
Excellent.
let us know. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I assume, Mr. Quijo, that you're also open to the public if they would like to schedule time to discuss any issues with staff.
Mayor, yes, absolutely.
Thank you. We'll move on to item 4B, presentation discussion regarding the proposed Title 18 of the Douglas Municipal Code for Historic Preservation. Again, staff wanted to bring this forward to give us to dip our toes into the water for this issue. It is quite extensive, and so this is going to be the first presentation of a few more before this important item comes for a vote in front of the council. Mr. Delorme, are you leading off on this, please?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. So today we'll be presenting the proposed ordinance on historic preservation, which would create Title 18 in the Douglas Municipal Code. We'll start off by, I guess, differentiating between our existing historic preservation overlay versus this historic preservation ordinance that's being proposed today. So currently, our existing historic preservation overlay, otherwise known as HP overlay, addresses land use. So it's more of a zoning issue more than anything, and it was adopted to encourage adaptive reuse and mixed use of underutilized buildings in our downtown area, which ultimately amended zoning regulations in the downtown to be more inclusive than the previously underlying zoning for that zoning district. In other words, you couldn't do mixed use back then. The HP overlay does have elements of historic preservation, but it doesn't really constitute comprehensive historic preservation efforts. Whereas this ordinance does have that. The HP overlay, I will address that later. It will be renamed at some point. But the historic preservation ordinance does require identification, basically identifying historic properties and to get them on the National Historic Registry or the State Historic Registry. Also for protection, using legal measures and regulations to safeguard our historic properties throughout the entirety of Douglas, not just in our downtown district. Maintenance to ensure ongoing care and upkeep of historic properties to preserve their integrity. And also has an element of education and advocacy, raising the awareness about the value of historic preservation and advocating for supportive policies and programs for historic preservation. So the question would be, why even create historic preservation regulations? One major one is downtown revitalization. It is a component of revitalization. Downtown revitalization is a holistic approach and not just focuses on one thing. So streetscape enhancements would be one of them, facade grant programs and other grant programs or incentives to revitalize downtown goes into this, and part of that is historic preservation, which I'll discuss more a little later on the incentive piece. It also addresses the community concerns about the buildings downtown. During our streetscape community input phase, there was a lot of concerns brought up by the community on the state of the buildings downtown. So this would kind of help address a lot of that. And then it also would be to facilitate programs for historic properties, such as incentives, which I'll go into at a later time. And the overall enhance the appeal and the economic vitality of our historic downtown area, which goes hand in hand with downtown revitalization. But the reason for this ordinance is to allow us to apply to become a certified local government. And CLG status, as I'll call it throughout this presentation, would make us eligible for specialized assistance to our State Historic Preservation Office, and give us access to funding for historic preservation programs. And to go into CLG status eligibility, a local government must enact and enforce an ordinance for the designation and protection of historic properties, and the ordinance must, at minimum, include the following provisions: a statement of purpose, definitions, establishment of a commission with specific membership and duties assigned, historic designation procedures for local resources and or districts, criteria for historic designation of local resources and districts, provisions for public hearings on historic designation with public notifications, mandatory review of alterations, relocations, or demolitions of historic resources, whether they be individually or within the historic district boundaries. I'll talk about that more a little later. Specific guidelines to be used by the commission, specific timeframes and procedures for reviews and for consideration of appeals, and provisions for decision-making, enforcing decisions, and the right to appeal. Now, this proposed draft that was presented to you has been reviewed by the State Historic Preservation Office to ensure that all of these elements are in that ordinance. They have notified us that they are. We would just need to pass and adopt it. So next, we'll just get into, I'll go through each articles. There's 6 articles within that ordinance. The first one just lists the title, purpose, and intent. Title: Historic Preservation Ordinance of the City of Douglas, and its purpose is to preserve and protect Douglas's historic architectural and cultural heritage, encourage the maintenance and preservation of historic properties, enhance Douglas's attractiveness to visitors, foster community pride by celebrating our past, guide alterations to maintain historic integrity, promote neighborhood preservation and revitalization, to discourage demolition and inappropriate alterations to historic properties, and to document and recognize historic significant cultural locations. Article 2, that's the section where we would have to put definitions. So we did. I didn't put all of them on here. Those are just the key ones that I think you should be made aware of, which is historic property, downtown core zoning district, HP district overlay, historic preservation commission, contributing, non-contributing, certificate of appropriateness, and certificate of no effect. For sake of time, I will just give you two key definitions to help you, differentiate between our existing HP overlay and what an HP district overlay is. So right now, the HP overlay will be renamed to our downtown core zoning district. After, if mayor and council were to pass this ordinance, and then it would establish historic preservation district overlays, which is an area designated as containing land, sites, houses, buildings, structures, or objects that contribute to the historic character and understanding of the development of Douglas as a unique place. So, yeah. Just move on to Article 3. Article 3 just establishes the Historic Preservation Commission. The commission would have 7 members appointed by mayor and approved by the council. Its role would be to review the standards, design review, conduct hearings, provide guidance on historic preservation programs or historic preservation design guidelines, act as advocates and liaise with other entities in the pursuit of historic preservation. Where its powers and duties would be recommend designations of historic properties, review applications, and approve certificates. They will also advise on preservative initiatives and act as community advocates and accept donations of conservation easements and development rights on historic properties. The thing with this ordinance and the Historic Preservation Commission is we already have something similar to it in our code known as the Design Review Board, where the Design Review Board is responsible for ensuring that improvements or new construction within the existing historic preservation overlay and the Design Review Overlay Zone maintain appropriate architectural design that aligns with the historic nature of its surrounding properties. Its duties include protecting historically significant aesthetics within the HP overlay and Design Review Overlay Zone. Upon adoption of Title 18, the changes to the Design Review Board would be that the Historic Preservation Commission would replace the Design Review Board and absorb its powers and duties, but also augment them a little bit. The removal of the Design Review Overlay Zone from the zoning code and the introduction of Historic Preservation District overlays to replace the Design Review Overlay Zones. Article 4 lists the nomination and designation processes for historic properties. The designation criteria was actually taken from the Secretary of Interior's standards on historic preservation, where it has to be at least 50 years old and possess historical, architectural, or cultural significance. And that's just for an individual building. To recommend the creation of a historic preservation district overlay, it would require that the district have multiple properties that meet the designation criteria for an individual property, constitute a distinct section of the city, and the majority of property owners within that proposed district would have to concur with the designation of that historic property overlay district or historic preservation district overlay. And it also outlines the process, the application process, the review process, public hearings, deadlines, commission determination actions, and council action. And it would also create the Douglas Historic Property Register. Article 5 outlines the design review and the issuance of certificates. And within that, we'll talk about demolition, but the purpose of this article is the meat of this ordinance. It's for the preservation of landmarks and historic districts. Certificates of no effect and certificate of appropriateness would be required for anyone wanting to do any alterations or construction within a historic district or for a historic property that's on the registry. And a certificate of no effect, that's just a minor work that doesn't alter any aesthetics of its historic nature of whatever building that they want to make alterations to. And that would be approved administratively, more likely through development services. And the certificate of appropriateness requires design review from the Historic Preservation Commission, where they do the whole design review, not just using the Secretary of Interior's standards and guidelines on historic preservation, but also in line with the City of Douglas historic preservation guidelines. This article also outlines the procedures for the application for those certificates, the criteria for approval, and the public hearing timelines and decision process. It also outlines enforcement of this ordinance. The building inspector would ensure compliance for any work proposed through those certificates. And they would have authority to issue stop work orders for non-compliance of the proposed work. It also outlines the appeals process and the violations and penalties for this ordinance. Article 6 and the final article outlines incentives. It would actually create and implement the Douglas Landmark Restoration Program. And it's a program to facilitate financial assistance for preservation, restoration, and rehabilitation of historic properties and or districts. It would have eligibility criteria, which would have to, a property would have to be on the Douglas Historic Property Register to be eligible for this program. It also outlines grant application process and funding criteria. And grant recipients must convey a conservation easement to the city in exchange for funding under this program. It would also codify that the city would provide additional financial resources for historic preservation and assist in identifying additional financial resources, guidance on grants for structural assessments and environmental analyses, and maintain a list of potential financial resources. This is something that we as a city are already doing. We're just codifying it so that later generations can maintain these efforts. And the next steps would be the adoption of Title 18 by Mayor and Council, the implementation of the ordinance, and initiate the programs such as the Landmark Restoration Program. Amend the zoning code. So with the passage of this title, we would have to make amendments to sections 513 and 514, excuse that, to remove redundancies and dissolve the Design Review Board and transfer responsibilities to the Historic Preservation Commission. And then also continue with our downtown revitalization efforts to rejuvenate the downtown. Some of those financial reasons that I was talking about in Article 6 is brownfield grants. So area-wide planning, right now we're looking at structural integrity assessments and environmental analyses, but area-wide planning encompasses a lot more than that. We're starting to get a grasp or like an understanding of what we can do with area-wide planning funding, which later we'll tweak our approach and bring different resources to the fold at a later time. Also redevelopment area, which allows for grants that go beyond exterior alterations. And an enhanced facade improvement grant program, which the city currently has. It would just be augmented funding and different matching requirements. And with that, that's my presentation. I welcome any questions from Mayor and Council.
Thank you, Mr. Lorame and staff for working on this. This is, again, part of our Douglas Vision 2032 and greatly appreciated. Any questions or comments from our council?
Mr. Mayor.
Yes, please, Mr. Shelton.
Now, when we talk about grants for restoration and revitalization and so forth, well, here, the Gadsden is right in front of us. The Gadsden or maybe the Elks Club or whatever might need work or whatever. Is that what we're talking about? If there's a building that needs help you write a grant? Did we match it or what's the process on this?
Mayor, Mr. Shelton. So the grant program within this ordinance, it would be a grant program administered by the city of Douglas to provide funding for certain things. I'll give you a list. Exterior wall repairs, roof repairs or replacements, window and door rehabilitation and weatherization improvements, structural reinforcement, exterior woodwork, masonry, stucco repairs, porch and step repairs, cornices and parapet repairs, ADA alterations, storefront restorations, foundation repairs, historic outbuilding rehabilitation, reversal of previous inappropriate alterations, demolition of non-historic additions, or the reconstruction of original architectural porch and step repairs elements based on historic documentation and physical evidence. So it's yes.
It has to be a historical building.
It has to be a historic building. Through this Title 18, it would have to be in the Douglas Historic Property Register. Forgot what it's called. In order to be eligible for this program itself. So.
Okay, one of the comments, maybe too bad. I don't know if this would have happened or not. But, you know, we should have had these buildings done decades ago, you know, classified as historical buildings. And it would have been something, you know, when the two churches burned down, they would absolutely would have been on the historical thing. We, you know, that might have been able to help them out.
Right, yeah, so that's right. We previously in the past, we didn't have any sort of program or ordinance to help facilitate designation of historic properties. It could be done through the State Historic Preservation Office currently. This would make it easier for local residents and property owners to be able to get designation on historic properties, essentially.
Mayor,
Yes, please, Ms. Costa.
and I could give a little bit more context to that too. In one of my insomniac late night reading, the certified local historic preservation funding. And I let Mr. People know about this, and that's how we came, you know, and learned a little bit more about this. But there was an effort back in the 80s. And there's a list of tons of properties in the downtown district, some of which the owners back then didn't want to be part of this list. But it seems like somewhere along the lines in the 80s, the ball was dropped. Yeah, but the process had started back then. And I'm glad to see that, you know, this is finally coming back to us and with this title. The only other question that I have is, are absentee owners addressed within Title 18 as far as, you know, holding them accountable and liable for any of these buildings that are falling apart?
Mr. Mayor, Councilmember Acosta, not quite. It does give authority to the building inspector to ensure that they're maintained. But ARS doesn't really allow us to, I guess, penalize them for any interior issues. And I would defer to Dennis on that one, so you could clarify more on the ARS.
Right, yeah, and I understand, like, you know, going into a building, but when you see that from the outside, these buildings are falling apart, you can only imagine that the inside is just as bad or worse. So even if it's just on the outside, if you could see there's broken windows, there's, you know, broken lights, there's the awnings are falling apart. I mean, we need to have something to hold these absentee owners responsible. So I would just like to see something at the very least for outside where we can see and where we don't need entry into a building to enforce that. If not, then it kind of serves no purpose for some of these buildings that are just sitting there empty and that, you know, the owners don't want to sell, don't want to do anything. I know that there are some out there, maybe, I'm not sure if we're limited because of state laws right now, but I mean, at the very least, the outside would be great for us to enforce.
Mayor?
Thank you, Mr. Yes, please, Mrs. Arquivo.
Yes, thank you. So excellent points. And I think because we are in draft phases of this new program, we can continue to work with legal as we create the ordinances and cross-reference our current program. So my immediate response is code enforcement in the current state allows us to pursue action with the parcel owner and not very successfully, I may add. And when we go through the motions and trying to reach property owners and we get no response because many of them are absentee owners, that's really our major struggle is not getting. So then we have other things we can do. And I think that's where we need to maybe reestablish that workflow and reassess what can we do and what are the steps we can cite and go to court. And if they remain absentee at that point, then there's other steps we can pursue. And I think that becomes an opportunity for us to get more aggressive on that side of code enforcement to align with this. And we can continue to take a look at that, but be more direct and specific on how we can hold that issue that we have to better accountability for that purpose. We can continue to report on that.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mr. Arquivo. Anyone else from the council?
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, please, Mr. Acosta.
And I believe we have had this discussion before with the absentee owners of those properties. But with the Title 18, the new ordinance, if adopted, you know, it's a step in the right direction. I was just appalled that we didn't have anything in place prior to this. And that explains why our buildings downtown, historical buildings are, you know, just in shambles, basically. And it's an eyesore for a community. And with the downtown revitalization with the streetscape, I think it's important that we do take into consideration Title 18, form that commission, and maybe with the commission and the law on our side, maybe we could get those absentee owners to move on or sell. So let's move on with this.
Thank you, Mr. Acosta. Anyone else?
Mr. Mayor, this is Damian, if I just may.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Mayor. Councilmember Acosta, I just wanted to point out, so a lot of the work's already done for the district designation. We have 3 historic designations in Douglas. Three historic districts designated to the National Registry, and 3 individual properties, that being the Douglas Municipal Airport, the Gatson Hotel, and the Grand Theater. So with the passage and adoption of Title 18 and the implementation of the Douglas or the Landmark Restoration Program, it would allow us to immediately do something with that grant program. I just wanted to point that out. And then any other building or property owners that would want to have historic designation, now we would have a way to do that locally, and then work with SHPO, State Historic Preservation Office, to get us on the state and national registry. So I just wanted to point that out.
Appreciate it. I mean, just the work that you put into this. And, you know, like, again, I'd like to see some positive out of this, and, you know, there's just the eyesore of those buildings, but moving on with this Title 18, it sounds like you know, in the right direction. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Acosta. Anyone else? Thank you, staff, so much for this presentation. And again, if you have questions or input, please feel free to contact Mr. Quijos so that we can have that looked into and explored so that we can come up with the best ordinance in Title 18 that's around. Okay, going back to item 4A, the budget presentation, did anybody happen to think of anything additional that they would like to offer or question?
Mayor,
Yes, please, Mr. Montaño.
yeah, I think this question would be for our city manager. On the memo, for the state share revenues, since the final amount's not gonna be yet to us till after the approval of the budget, you mentioned on there that, this year we have prepared some reserve levels in case we experience another reduction. By any chance, would you know more or less what those levels are?
Yes, it's 300,000 that we created, or we placed in general government reserve. We can show you the place on your
No, that's
budget
fine.
sheet, yes.
But my follow-up question would be, how will the reserves be used if there is no reduction? So if we have those extra $300,000, is there a plan for that, for that?
There's no plan currently, so I was waiting to see what questions or direction council may have, because then we go into the operating budget. So the general government reserve is a reserve that we keep under our revenue sources, which is very different from our fund balance and reserves outside of the budget. So that is a sustainable revenue, a sustainable part of our operating budget, and it can be used in a variety of ways. We have that 300,000, and then we've placed under Vision 2032, 100,000 as well. And we have, I think, council projects that we usually allow for an amount. I'd have to get staff to check that amount. 100 as well. 110. So those are what we keep, because things come up during the year where we don't have to go to fund balance. They can be used towards Title 18, for example, to begin small steps towards provision of grants. We can do other things that we feel need to be handled. If it is the will of council, we can come back with some ideas, or we can strictly leave them in reserve, general government reserve under the operating budget, to use as things come up during the year as we start rolling out some of the historic preservation. So Title 18, we're taking baby steps. We're working with many partners for other forms of assistance to the community, low interest loans. We do have funding for assessments at no cost to business owners from an environmental and structural perspective. But then once you get beyond that, we are pushing the CLG status so that we can be eligible for more grants and create a fund for that program. But until we get there, we may need to come up with a little bit of a cushion to get that started. I'd like to also increase some of our facade program. Currently, it's set very low. It's at $2,500. And it's a direct match, 1-to-1. So we usually are not able to do much for that amount. And if we're going to help business owner and it's for the betterment of the community, I'd like to increase some of that as well. Those are my ideas initially, and I'm open to suggestions as well from you. Like I say, I'm available to work with Q&A, continue Q&A until tentative budget. Unfortunately, we won't get the state shared revenue figures until after tentative.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And I think it's a solid plan to have that available for throughout the year, as some of the things like you mentioned are unforeseen, and we may get all of a sudden a landslide of requests for Title 18 type things. And so I think that's a great approach to being able to do that. Anyone else? Hearing none, I'd like to move on to item number 5, adjournment. May I have a motion to adjourn?
Mayor, I move to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
Motion by Mrs. Acosta, second by Mr. Montano to adjourn our special meeting of June 5th, 2024. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. The opposed by nay. It appears the ayes have it. We stand adjourned at 6:21 PM. Thank you all.
Thank you,
All right.
everyone.
Have a good
Have a good
evening,
night.
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.